I started with the idea of conscious social change as like this particular design philosophy and methodology that I was using in my work at Global Grassroots when I ran that organization, where mindfulness is used as a design tool to solve social problems. And it's sort of a methodology of creative, compassionate problem solving and solutions building. But I feel now that it's expanding for me, that beyond just like this particular approach that we developed, it also has it has this connection to this deeper and broader field that we're defining, where inner work and consciousness and spirituality um, is integrated into social change work around the world, which is very exciting to discover. That we're part of a field and that this field is growing. So, yeah, I see it as really describing this intersection of the inner meeting the outer.
Thanks, Gretchen. And like you said there, it's a broad field with more and more people coming into that field. I'm interested in perhaps some of any key differences, but also commonalities between the different approaches. What they might be telling us about human nature and humanness and what people need in the world.
That's a big question. I think there was a point in about 5 or 6 years ago when we were having, as a nonprofit, Global Grassroots. So just to back up, so I no longer run Global Grassroots. That has shut down as a 501c3 in the US, but for 18 years, it was based in East Africa, working with women survivors of war and genocide in Rwanda and northern Uganda and girls throughout that region, and helping them design social solutions in their own communities around the ideas that they would devise for their own social issue priorities. Very local women-led endeavors, and we ran this mindful social venture incubator. We were doing, the women wanted to work on a whole range of different issues. For a long time, we were doing water infrastructure because water was core to everything. It ensured that they didn't have to spend all day collecting it, so they could have other economic pursuits. It was, helped clean water would ensure no more waterborne disease, and girls could go to school. And so it was the center of so much in those communities. And we saw over 15 years that these water projects were able to sustain themselves, like 96 to beyond percent sustainability rates, which is really unheard of in the water infrastructure realm around the world and international development. And we tried to delve deeper into why that was. And what we discovered was that the mindfulness work that we were doing with people and the mind-body trauma healing changed the way that they were relating to their communities. They brought a deeper level of compassion and deeper understanding and more collaborative orientation. They wanted to solve problems together. They learned from places of opposition and resistance instead of thinking they needed to fight it. And as a result, they built ownership and a sense of shared investment in this asset for the whole community. And every thing that they earned from selling water, they reinvested in other things that the community needs. So it just was this cycle of benevolence, and it sustained and had many ripples of impact. But we found that the funders were less interested in the mindfulness side. Not all of them. We had some really amazing partners that really understood this intersection, but a lot of them were like, just why is your water infrastructure more expensive than just drilling this well? And it was because of this investment in the well-being, the inner leadership, the mindfulness of this community of leaders. And it was really hard to make a case for why the inner work mattered for the social change. So we went through like a huge third party monitoring and evaluation, impact assessment. We decided to do research on all of the scholarly and clinical studies on, the neurobiology of mindfulness. Like, how can we explain why this works and how it's making us more pro-social and connected and trust building? And then but all those clinical studies were built on very arbitrary circumstances, like, oh, we had like 20 college students, they did a mindfulness class, and then they like walked outside and we wanted to see if someone fell down, if they offered to help them or not. We're like, this doesn't fit to what we're doing. I wonder who else in this field is doing something similar. And we started to discover incredible organizations all around the world that were integrating an inner contemplative or spiritual component into the way they actually delivered their programs. And we got really fascinated. We wanted to study the common ground among them, and realized also that they really didn't see themselves as part of a field like us, operating in isolation, knowing intuitively this mattered, but not seeing that we were connected to other organizations. And some are operating in prisons, and others in classrooms, and others on climate change. And yet here we have this common thread. And so since that time, it's been just this extraordinary experience of recognizing there's a field here that exists. And so back to your question, I've found that there's a lot of different common threads, but some of the things that are common to the organizations that we have had a chance to get to know, and there's so many more to learn from, is that the inner and the outer are integral. That it's not, we go on retreat, we do this inner, and we sort of recalibrate, and then we go back to doing the work. Like, it goes way beyond personal sustainability and well-being. It's actually core to the theory of change, to the ways in which we understand change, diagnose change, and or diagnose issues, and then create solutions to problems, and how we deliver transformation in the world. Also, a lot of these models are built on relationality. Like, it matters, that relationship with other people, and how that is done is different. In many of them, it's a personal relationship, or it's collaborative, or it's community based, but the relational is emphasized over transactional. There's also an embrace of many ways of knowing, I think. People are willing to trust their hearts and build on the intuitive and draw insight from nature, and be in somatic processes, but that the integration of practice and the sensing through contemplative practice or a spiritual sense is a piece of the choices and the ways that people learn and share wisdom beyond just like the mental mind, intellectual understanding of things. And there is also a common thread of recognizing how important it is to dismantle, name, understand, move beyond the oppressive systems that have been built wherever you may be, whether it's just in the US or globally, some of which is influenced by colonialism, white supremacy, patriarchy, capitalism, that we have to imagine new ways of being with each other. and recognize that we're connected, we're interconnected, and that includes nature. I think it's conventional paradigms often are divorced from nature, and in a lot of these more conscious and mindful organizations, there's a recognition and an appreciation for, if not like even nature's metaphors, like continue to guide this work. And some even go so far as to like really consulting with nature in choices too as partners. So there's more, but that's sort of the first themes that come to mind from what we've seen around the world.
Yeah, it's a wonderful description. Thank you, Gretchen. And I think we might come on to some of these things are also about, or for us, about definitions. So where is this line between inner and outer and change in both? And I think we're going to come on to a couple of those themes, but I've got one more question before I'll hand over to Eddie, which is about your experience that you described with the funders, some of whom were great and some of whom weren't perhaps getting what you were trying to do with the inner work. And I think for us working in this space, that feels sometimes baffling. Like this is about people's inner life and well-being and consciousness. It can feel difficult to try and pivot to that way of viewing things. I'm just interested if you have a sense of what drives that in that community that you're working with, those funders, or in general, because it's definitely a thing in society that there's a reaching towards what feels tangible and material, and at the expense of this other world, which actually is in some ways so much more powerful.
Right. Well, I will say I think things are changing, have changed a lot, especially in the last 5 years since COVID, since a lot of the political changes in the US, since George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement. There's been there's a few different movements that I've seen have changed, but before I come to that, those shifts, I think one of the challenges that I've seen with the tensions in philanthropy is the desire to have a catalytic impact and to really shift means that we're oriented around outputs, measurements that demonstrate the most effective use of capital. So where can we have the greatest return on investment in the shortest amount of time? And so it's set up to require organizations to answer to that within a calendar year grant cycle. And personal transformation often takes longer, and it's, I believe, more sustainable if you're part of shifts that come because you have a fundamental shift in yourself and your own mindset and your own belief systems and your own behavior and practices. Like you're much more likely to continue on and deepen that kind of change and sustain it than if it's like a short-term, temporary, transactional sticks or carrots kind of solution. And but if we're focused on short-term results, we don't have time to track or to invest more deeply in longer-term transformation that comes through more complex and inner-driven models. I mean, I'm not saying that's true of all shifts that are inner-driven or all organizations that are short-term are missing the inner, but just these seem to be kind of the tensions. And so, you know, we'd have this really complex model for young women that transformed the way they saw themselves and their entire trajectory of their future. But we were compared to like, well, you cost 4 times more than like a just paying for their school fees. We're like, that's that's because of the complexity of the model and the relational ways and the support. And it's hard to compete with that. And it's hard to explain why that matters. Now, I think the shifts that we're seeing are towards that are really encouraging are towards more trust-based philanthropy that recognizes the lived experience and wisdom of those that are closest to and experiencing the issue. Releasing, some of this, the rigidity around the timing and the outputs and the expectations, and that leaves more space for us to explore things like transformation that is hard to measure in quantitative terms, and mindfulness being infused more in philanthropy, recognizing its own power to see change in the role of wealth holders in new ways, and the investment in inner work itself. There's been such an increase in investment in mindfulness practices, consciousness science, and alternatives and alternative ways of doing philanthropy. So I think it's changing. It still is a small subset of the philanthropic sector, but I think it is growing. And I think we're starting to see why it matters too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I want to have a million thoughts, of course. I think, well, one of the things I think I'll say here, though, is when you mentioned earlier about it matters how we define, Matt, you led into it, and Gretchen, you followed up, how we diagnose issues, how we identify what solutions are, and how in your experience of building projects, like there's something at the base that, like, when you have a shift in your person, how you understand the issue might shift away from the people that you might, or the things that how you used to define it. The issue is with this person, is with this thing, and you turn towards something else when you are in an orientation that sees the people different from you as community versus opposition.
Yes, well said.
You see the land as a part of your community, not just a resource to be used. How you see solutions also shifts, which I think is it's just so, I think that is the profound nature and work, role of spirituality in this work. But I'm curious to see, like, when we are talking about this, is that the critical, and I guess maybe I'll start at a different place. That also seems, we're at a time where spirituality and consciousness seems to be growing, and yet at the same time there seems to be a lot of lack of it. And I think maybe specifically in certain cultures and certain societies that seems to be a thing. One, is that reflective of what you're also seeing or experiencing, and what ideas might you have about how that might have happened? Like, how do we get to this place where spirituality is a thing that people might be thirsty or longing for?
I mean, good questions. First of all, I appreciate how you've described the way when we start to shift from a more inner reflective orientation, and we start to see our own role in perpetuating the status quo, or we come to understand change from the inside out, because now we're seeing our own unconscious bias and behavior, and we're like working on it. Then we're like, oh, instead of all the finger pointing like it's you, or you're the problem, we start to acknowledge with more compassion, okay, yeah, we all are doing this. We all have wounds and traumas and compensations and shadows and blind spots. And now I see how you're reactive. I'm going to be curious about that. I'm going to say, tell me more, like, as opposed to you're the problem. And that leads us to a whole different understanding of a system than this one-dimensional binary of we're good, you're not. So
yes.
And yet the world is so divided, and increasingly so, and even with the rise of certain, religious based conflict. And why is that? I struggle with understanding what's missing all the time. I think I can't speak for everybody else or the masses, but I think what kind of occurs to me at the essence, there's a few things. One is trauma. There's a lot of trauma, especially in my culture in the US. We're building on 400 plus years of slavery and genocide's impact on people and generations. And that's real.
Yeah.
And that puts us in total stress response mode. Regularly, we're reactive. We're compensating to protect ourselves from vulnerability. We need or grasp at power to feel safe. We're judging from our shadows. Like that's our responsiveness. And we're raised in systems that are predominantly about individual self-sufficiency, not communal well-being, and disconnected from nature and increasingly sucked into technology. And I think we are missing communities of practice that bring us back to connecting with our deeper wisdom and nature. And so we're really, folks are wanting belonging because that's a natural urge, but instead of discovering that inherent connection, we're seeking out sameness that preferences in groups and otherizes or demonizes the out group. We want meaning, but we're finding that in winning, conquering, pursuing ends without thinking about the fact that we're all connected. So if some of us are not well, we're all not well. We're wanting change, but we're getting it through force and sticks and carrots rather than that relational connection. And so it requires a real pause to reconnect with heart and land and each other and ourselves. And I think people there's a certain subset of the population that's seeking that out.
Yeah.
And others, I think, maybe feeling lonely or trying to find what's missing and haven't necessarily found it in that way. And anyway, we're still all suffering the process. That sounds really heavy. What do you think?
Yeah, and I listen, we can take a breath, right? Because that was definitely but I'll say this for myself. When I think about this, 24/7, I think. But it's I have the thought that says there's so many things to say, but I'll say two things. The first thing I'll say is, for me, I definitely agree with trauma. And I think that there are two elements about the trauma specifically that I think are hard for us to keep our eyes on. One of those things I think is we think of big T trauma a lot, of like the most violent things, which I won't name necessarily because I don't want to, trigger people, but the things that we know to go to, these are the big things. But I think we have a harder time noticing the subtle traumatic experience of navigating violent systems that were inherited. Where you don't get to decide what your gender expression is before somebody tells you what it is.
Right.
You don't get to determine what expectations are on your physical body's capabilities before you even discover what they are, or you go through life and have changes that affect how your physical body moves. But there's a societal norm that's already created that you are, even with whatever power and resilience that you build within yourself, you still are forced to navigate that discovery, that exploration in a certain social context. And I think that that buzz that is underneath the surface for so many of us is more impactful than we realize, and that it is more influential in our decision making and what we can even see for
Yeah,
ourselves or imagine for
absolutely.
ourselves because of the constant idea of what you have to do to survive. All right. And how closely that may be related to directly being in conflict with your physical relationship with yourself, the land, and the people around you. So I think that that's a big element of it. I also think that there is the element that oppressive systems don't aren't oppressive on the surface, if that makes sense. And so, like, you don't. If I were born into a family that had an ideology, like a kind of prejudice against another group of people, the people I learned that prejudice from aren't monsters to me, or
No.
they may not be terrible people. They're people that I love, people who I share all the feels of family and community with. They are my community. And so, and the machine that makes for the oppression isn't one that's ran by individual intention necessarily. It's a moving thing that gain momentum over time, that's so much
Mhm.
larger than any one family, any one conversation. And I think that because of and it also doesn't take any work. You don't necessarily have to be actively oppressing to be participating in the oppression
Mhm.
of a system that you are in. But you do have to actively, if you decide to do the opposite, push against a force that you otherwise can unknowingly just float in. And
Right.
I think that that is what makes the work of systems change and social change difficult, is that oppression is about imposed acceptance, agreement, alignment. Social change requires that you build community you shift community in a different direction. You pull people away from the gravitational pull of whatever is normal or what
Mhm.
society upholds. And I think that that's a different way of being in community that may honestly insist that you exist outside of what's normal, and unfortunately safe, but not always because of a direct sense of violence, but internally. Does it feel safe to exist outside of um, the norms of what you must do to survive capitalism
Yep.
or survive whatever the social stratosphere is in your culture, in your country?
Right.
So yeah, so yeah,
That resonates, and I think it's hard if you've grown up as part of that dominant culture because the benefits are what's centered. We're profit making, efficiency based, fix it, perfect it. There's those benefits are upheld without making the the harm front and center. And so much of that, the qualities of those systems are so baked into our existence that they become invisible. So anything new feels so unfamiliar, and you can catch yourself in very easy ways of judging and questioning. Well, it's going to take a long time to make a consensus based decision. Why can't we just whatever that is that you're shifting, it feels it's what our norms are really conditioned, sometimes so blindly that it's really hard to even invite a curiosity around what another way could be and what values it could bring.
absolutely. Well, one that makes me think, and I'm curious for us to just keep exploring in this way. One, there's two things I know I really want to talk about, but I'll say the first one of when we're thinking about the idea that our sense of what we want, like the rewards, are centered. I have a bit of a idea of saying, in talking with Matt, we talked about the idea of liberating money,
Mm, mm,
to really imagine what could we potentially create when we allow ourselves to think about what collaboration might produce. especially from a state of what we deserve inherently. Like, everyone has inherent value. What then do we create? And I have we've been talking about this thought of like, what is the vision that we might hold for, like, right now, capitalism, and it promises wealth and efficiency. But what might collaboration and compassion produce that efficiency and wealth can't afford?
Mm.
You know, when what might we produce when the basis of what makes something a financially sound choice is the good it can do for society? How many people will benefit from this thing that we do, in collaboration and in harmony with the earth and the environment in that idea. And so I think that it's interesting to play in that world. And it makes me wonder, what visions or dreams, like imagining in this work, like this work succeeds, we're able to really integrate this. What visions or what dreams are you kind of holding space for this
Mm.
work? For either a specific community or just kind of in general, what dreams are you holding space for as possible?
Right. Well, I want to just what you're
Yeah,
describing about money and capitalism.
yeah,
Things I imagine. Um, they're just really quick, and I'll come back to your
yeah,
question. Two
yeah.
things that I wonder about: if the entire realm of value was quantified by the capitalist, orientation, like all the externalities of harm or benefit from doing things in one way for multiple generations forward were captured in that idea of profit. Like, actually, we would see we're running this massive deficit for the sake of the planet, and like the relational ways and its impact. We would see things so differently based on what we are valuing and including and how we think about that. And so I always wonder, what would that be like if we calculated things differently? And then I loved a perspective shared by an indigenous group at a deep it was a deep change gathering, like, oh my gosh, 15 years ago. And I think it was a Hopi Indian group, but I cannot remember who they were. But their premise was that money grows toxic when it's stagnant. And
Mm,
what would it be like if it was constantly flowing towards its higher purpose?
mm,
And what if that higher purpose was informed by all and nature? Like, what would it look like if just money was not restrained by a few, but it was able to be a common resource that moved where it needed to go? What would that look like? It would be such a
uh,
different way of being. And I would love to see that modeled in some community. So those are some sort of imaginings on the wealth-based front or resources front. But what else do I imagine? I mean, what's so fun about being in this field now is that I don't have to I'm constantly being presented with new things that I couldn't have imagined because other organizations are doing them. So
yes,
that's amazing. And I love that. And I just feel inspired to, celebrate and center and showcase this world where inner work and social change intersect. But yeah, I wonder what it would be like if we lived in ways where what we were doing was built on common values and relational ways, not transactional ways of being. And if we were all doing our deep inner work and finding our unique contribution and trusting what that was instead of needing to fit it into some career path, and and valuing, like, creating beauty as much as addressing something else that is a yucky, role, but it is all part of what's needed. And
Mhm.
if if we could if we could really find a way to be informed by a broader source or consciousness, and trust it, there could be a lot of different ways that that we exist and that change could happen. That can sound idealistic, but I'm not necessarily sure it is, because there are communities doing this. This is an ancient way of being too. We've just forgotten.
Oh my God, absolutely. I just love that. I love that reflection, especially the thought of if money being toxic when it's stagnant and allowing it to flow. I absolutely love that. And I love the idea of I definitely feel and that I mean even our ideas about what is idealistic versus not. Our ideas of practicality are defined by the current social structures that tell us how much a banana costs, you know,
Yeah.
while at the same time suggesting that there is if that land that we get bananas from could be profitable in another way, that we'll get rid of bananas if we need to,
I'm
right? And so it's like, it's interesting to imagine the depths of kind of existentialism you can kind of get to in this work, which again lends itself to the spirituality and tapping into broader consciousness in order to make space for that kind of inquiry. So I'll stop because I know Matt has some questions or thoughts. Yeah.
Well, it's wonderfully rich, both. I'm going to come in with a question which I think sort of brings some of these threads together. It doesn't in my mind, right? We'll see. Which is about the nature of the change that we're kind of all seeking and working for. And we've talked a little bit about the current structure of society is driven by the nature of the individual alone in the world, trying to make their mark and make their impact in a very kind of, also I think, very gendered way. Men move, dig, build kind of approach to living. And then there's something always in me, Gretchen, when we talk about inner work that I'm like just sort of nibbling away at, which is this idea of something that goes inward and into the individual, when what we want is a world which is communal and in which everyone can experience that opportunity to feel more relational and in a state of kind of being with themselves. And is there ever a danger or risk that we divide this into inner and outer work because we're following on the model that we've been given about these individuals alone, and that might not always lead us to do the kind of community building social change work that we need to do?
I mean, I suppose, yeah, we could get too immersed in our own isolation and disconnection from each other. And there is a risk of that because we are connected. But, we're each unique expressions of divine creation. And the inner work is only, something that we have control over for our own selves. So we have to start there and understanding, how we are implicated in the systems that maintain the status quo, how we're contributing to that. There is an invitation to do that. But I think if we lose touch that with the fact that we are all connected, which ironically, like deeper inner work does bring us back to feeling that connection, that interconnection. and recognizing that it's in the relational field, I think, where we also learn and grow. Like we have to, through relationships, like this is where we're mirrored. This is where we come to understand ourselves in how we and our role within our ecosystem, our community, and where we find senses of belonging and the value of learning and connection and contributing, and all the structures and the systems are built within that interconnected, woven network. And so, there's inherently a connected element that we sometimes forget. And I think we could forget that from the spiritual perspective, we could forget that from the self-sufficiency, individualism perspective too. And I'm reminded of this image that came to me in this like really deep breathwork session that I have always has kind of stayed with me. If I could share it, if you can imagine like a balloon, someone's blown up a balloon and you're holding it like this, and it's like starting to lose its air. So it's a little squishy. You can like stick your fingers in and you can see them poking into the balloon. If you look at it, you could see all your little fingers inside, right? Okay. So I feel like all the little fingers inside the balloon inside the balloon is our conceptual reality of like, we are independent actors. Each finger is poking in the balloon and it can touch each other. And it's in this reality of being separate, but actually it is animated and sourced from this same space that's all outside the balloon. We just perceive ourselves to be separate on the inside in that limited reality. And so once we start to recognize, we have this inherent, nature that is all being fueled by some level of consciousness, spirituality, and that we are unique expressions. So we're responsible for our own, what is ours to do in the world, but actually we are still part of something bigger and can act from that orientation, and seeing ourselves in others and learning from our connections to others, then we navigate differently. But anyway, yeah. And I'm curious because you all have been steeped in the realm of compassion. Once practices help us develop that capacity, how do things change in the way that people relate to each other and themselves when you start to feel that particular recognition of another's suffering and the desire to alleviate it? That seems to be one of these really core bridges between self and other.
For sure. Yeah. Oh, I love the image as well. And I'm going to come back to that in a moment. But I think the best way to describe, I think, the experience that I've seen, and this is drawing perhaps especially from politics, where, believe it or not, it is possible to still bring people back to this understanding, just about. And I choose that example because also that's a field where that ingrained way of seeing people as separate and not even as people, it goes beyond that, is so ingrained. That's what comes back to people, I think, to see both that they are a human and see the human in them, and to see them as an individual and a person with those feelings. It takes away so much of the common automatic, very sort of I'm not reaching for quite the right words, but the machine orientated almost way that we operate with one another, to something that's very much more real. The thing that I'm going to bring it back to in a moment is then about how that gets sustained and moved to action and behavioral change with others, because I think that's what we're all kind of grappling with. But before going there, Eddie, do jump in on this question as well.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, and I think it's going to lead into what you might mention, because I think that honestly, coming in contact with compassion doesn't have a uniform response. I think that sometimes coming in touch with compassion can also be upsetting. I think
Mhm.
that like when you're open, when you start to carry sensitivity to suffering that you weren't maybe aware of or conscious of or empathetic around, it the world could potentially feel less comfortable.
Mm.
Things that used to not concern you. There's just angst that you're worried about, and if you're in a position where you don't feel connected to the power to act on it, it can be really upsetting for people. Which is why
Yeah.
we think it's important to be able to do this kind of work in community,
Yeah.
and to do it with practices that help you hold and build the capacity to hold that energy, and even to identify, is this my energy? Is this energy I'm sensing? To have those kinds of skills. Um, but in the same way, I think that I like the idea of every bit of this compassion, especially for the world, is like it makes us more alive in
Mm.
a sense. It
Mhm.
brings us further into life, deeper into connection to the world around us, and therefore it just enriches things. The wind feels like something more now. Conversations can feel a little more rich, because you give yourself a certain kind of permission that it just allows you to show up more, I think, in your world in a different way. And I think there's been a lot of studies to show, once you get connected to that feeling, it makes you move. People want to do something about that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, but even I think that there are a lot of ways that it can show up for people. Yeah.
Yeah, well, definitely, that was where I was going, Eddie, in
Mm.
what you described as that rupture. I think that people feel both from an image of themselves that they might have had before, which can be quite
Right.
confusing, and also from the mindset they might have had about society and the way that works. And I think of frustration as well. I mean, I mentioned politicians slightly jokingly in a way, but I think it is always important to remember when I've been doing work with politicians that they're not given permission to act with compassion and care. The system won't let that happen, or certainly won't let it happen on a routine, regular basis. And to have that experience happen to you must be very traumatic, and to then try and break out of it even more so. And that's kind of what we're trying to deal with. And that leads to this question, I suppose, which is about all our work. How will we build those practices in society, those spaces, communities, that makes it habitual, that makes it easier to come back to that feeling and experience that we might have in our own inner world. And I think that's partly why, I mean, self-compassion is so powerful for people, mainly because it's not something that we're taught, but it's also, I think, something that you can control to a greater degree, perhaps, than kind of building a system that's compassionate, or building a politics or a workplace that's compassionate, clearly. So it's a big question, Gretchen, but I'm wondering maybe a place to start would be how you're feeling that the conscious collective that you're building, and we're building together through the Garrison Institute, can help contribute to this, creating an outer world that reflects that compassion back to people.
Yeah. Thank you. That is a big question. Um, before I get to the Conscious Change Collective and that sort of field level, I kind of start by just like at the scale of one, like starting with self
Mm.
and family and moving outward. The things I'm contemplating is, where does practice fit in my day? If I went through an experiment once, which I should be doing regularly, is if I really believe in this intersection of inner work and outer work, then why am I not spending half of my waking hours doing inner work and half of my hours doing social change work? What would my work day look like if half it? Let's say I subscribe to the 8-hour day. What if I spent 4 hours doing inner work practice? What would that be like if I were in the forest dancing or meditating or reading a sacred text? Like, what if I shifted how I spent my time? What practices serve me? So I wonder about that. And how do I reorient what's most important? And I find that I'm still feeling always overwhelmed with the expectations of the systems and the society around me. I'm still in time scarcity mode. And I keep asking myself, I had this vision. Actually, I had a few like really powerful shamanic experiences, mystical experiences in connection with trees and listening to trees around the importance of deep listening to nature, listening to this planet. And if I embrace that identity instead of whatever my career is, like what would I, as someone who listens to trees, do in this moment, or what would love do in this moment, or what would, how do I orient every minute to reverence for the sacred, or a connection to nature, as opposed to what actually dominates my day? And so I'm constantly asking that question, and trying to practice and lean into it. And then I'm raising 2 kids, and I've got a 6-year-old and a 13-year-old. And what am I teaching them? How do I integrate that? I notice I probably spend 80% of my time with them being like, have you done your homework? Did you take your vitamins? Have you brushed your teeth? Like, are you ready to go? Like, where's your lunch? Like, hurry up, we're late. I'm constantly in the do and abide by the structures mode. So this is what I'm teaching them. What if instead we spent time discussing our dreams over breakfast instead of multitasking? What if instead we sat in nature together instead of, checking email or whatever else we're doing? So how do I shift and embrace the life force that's coming through my children instead of what they should do, or acknowledge and recognize their unique expression as it's forming and embrace their emotional complexity and validate instead of you're fine, or whatever we do. So that's where I think I'm starting and thinking about, how do I live differently? How do I build this in and weave it into my everyday? Now, relationally, I live in an intentional community. And so I have this really beautiful and unique opportunity to practice with 40 other people, 12 households that are trying to be committed to sustainable living and deep relationship and democracy. And it's really hard. It's hard because human beings, we have all our stuff and we're messy, and yet we are committed to staying in the fire with each other. It would be easy to be like, well, don't talk to that neighbor. But what does it actually mean to stay connected and to know each other deeply and to work through your challenges with heart and compassion and a desire to want to support the other's well-being also? Like, this is my tiny microcosm of, could we do this on a much larger scale? And it is challenging, but it provides so much opportunity for learning. And then from our workspace, how do we shift the way that we connect with each other? Where do we build in the spaciousness? How do we deeply listen? How do we move beyond task orientation? How do we practice together in settings that aren't used to practice? How do we care for ourselves and each other? And so to the Conscious Change Collective, with with this support from the Garrison Institute, but really this is a field-driven, field design-led community of organizations working at this intersection of inner work and social change. And the hope is that we can make this field more visible, that we can showcase these models of different ways of being, and how we might be able to work like a mycelial network to shift energy and resources and take collective action where it's needed within that network. And might we then serve as an alternative to the dominant paradigm? And what is the wisdom within this field, and what does it want? What else is emerging from this space? So I'm excited about what this collective and its many manifestations, but its collective values and wisdom hold for us as we learn from each other and grow. So that's what I'm contemplating on. How do we do it? I don't have all the answers. I'm just experimenting, but those are my many complex pieces of it. And I would love to know how it is infused in the ways that you all are existing, relating.
Well, I think what you did give us, Gretchen, was that kind of, because you started with yourself, and I think that is part of the structured way of thinking about it. You, your family, your community, your workplaces and institutions, and that is certainly a very useful approach for thinking about where we can start to make the impact and to build that around us as we do it. I hear you about the difficulty and the hardness of doing that work with your neighbors, and I kind of hope and wonder if, as we flex those muscles more and more, those things do become easier, and trying to still do it in a society around it, which doesn't make it easy, is possibly also partly what's playing out there. But I think for us, we're just starting out in what we're trying to do. And Eddie and I were discussing this earlier, that creating room for these kinds of conversations is going to be the first step. I think a really crucial first step, because these reflections are not things that we habituate into our life. And if we can at least start that in community being many, many different things, I think that's where the insights will gather and the curiosity begins and the opportunity is. But Eddie.
Yeah, I mean, it's very resonant, because we were just literally talking about this earlier, and I was saying, out of one of the sessions that we had last week about action, one of the things that came up was, opportunities for stillness. And I, in reflecting on it, thought more about stillness in all of the forms that it can happen, and stillness specifically, which I love that you talked about. What does it mean to take more of my 8-hour day and take it out of energy in this direction and put it in the direction of inner work? And to me, there's an element of stillness there that's not just in the practice, it's also in the energy that was taken away from the machine of the current status quo, that there's stillness there, that because there's no more energy flowing in that direction. It's flowing in a new direction, which I think is a part of, when we talk about systems change, what that modeling looks like. I know that for me, I've done a thing. I don't have road rage, but I have like one of its cousins. You know what I mean? And so I'm working on it. But honestly, I'm not. It's always because I love to put on the music and I'm just grooving. I know where I'm going, that kind of thing. But sometimes when I hit traffic unexpectedly, or like I have a moment, I'm just like, please, I'm supposed to be here by this time, so I could get here by this time. You're messing up my flow.
Right.
Right. But I remember there was a day specifically where I feel like, in a moment of awareness, it was kind of like, where are you rushing to? Like, what is this? Like if you're going to be late, you're going to be late. Like
Yeah.
traffic is a thing, this, but out of that came this kind of mantra that I've been practicing in times of anxiety around time in every direction, of saying, I trust my timing. Like I just trust it. If I'm late, it's fine. And there doesn't have to be like a grand moment around me being late, but there might be. And the significance of it may be something I'm never going to be aware of. But I like the energy of trusting my timing more than I like the energy of, oh my God, I'm going to be late.
Yeah. Yeah.
And yeah, and it seems, and I think about that because this feels, and I think this is helpful for the work we're trying to do. It seems small, but the same ideology that will send me out to do violence to someone else or participate in violence to someone else is connected to the same idea at the core of what I have to do in order to keep with the status quo. And so any little bit of, and it's made up of those little stories. Time is running out. You're not gaining time, you're losing time. The being late means you might not deserve access to something, so on and so forth. And I think that the more we can, in our own personal lives, start to deconstruct those building blocks of ideological frameworks that keep the system going, it helps us figure out, we start to see a little more when we loosen our own box,
Yeah.
And so I deeply resonate, and I'm practicing. I'm going to practice it today because I already have plans. I have my playlist set. So yeah.
Oh, I appreciate that. On the road rage, I don't understand why we are so easily triggered into anger by someone else's accidental moment. I mean, we're always mind wandering and not paying attention ourselves. If someone wanders into our lane, goes too slow, like cuts us off, like, are they really trying to harm us? And why does that make us so mad? I'm always surprised by that. But the idea of time, it reminds me when my daughter was little, before she could tell time, her answer to the question, "What time is it?" was, "It's right now, mommy." I'm like, "You're right. It's like that should be I just need a watch that all it says is right now. There's nothing, no hands, no numbers, just right now. That's all I should need." But
Yeah. But even with that, I'll stop here. But this gives, like, I say, one, I reference the Matrix a lot, one, because I love it, but also I think it is such an incredible metaphor to talk about the world. But one of the things I say is that I feel like when Neo could see the numbers, could like actually see the Matrix and see the ones and zeros, that's what it feels like sometimes when you start to kind of think about society in this way. And time as this group project, when we really think about it, that like I can embrace no time, but that's not the case for the store I'm trying to get to pick up my order, because those people have children to go home and prepare meals for, and those children have to get up to go to school, and and it's like we're in this like related interwoven network of things that kind of uphold time as this, whether you want to track it or not, we're in a social agreement to do so, and to operation and to operate and cooperate with each other based on that. And so, which is the reason why I think for us, going full circle, when we give ourselves space to question those things, we can arrange ourselves in new ways because our assumptions at the core are different about time, about each other, about value, those things that allow us to do that. So yeah, anyway, I've deeply resonant.
Well, and I think we've shared before already, possibly moments before this idea. What you said about a social agreement is that we haven't made this social agreement, but we kind of assume that we have. And that's exactly why the conversation and the questioning is so critical. I love what your daughter said, Gretchen, and I'm conscious of the time, funnily enough, and letting you go. But I think that's also really important just to finish on. This is again something that we reflected on quite a lot, is that this idea of this work can seem really difficult and really hard, but actually it's not creating something new, it's getting back in touch. And very often you do hear these wonderful perspectives on the world from young people because they haven't had that social conditioning yet. And I think they can be a very useful guide in that sense. But is there anything we didn't touch on that you would like to say in the last couple of minutes, Gretchen?
Well, I think from this idea of starting to recognize these social constructs and these unwritten social agreements of how we exist with each other, I'm often sorting through my conditioning around shoulds and what I let go of and what I consciously embark upon because either I recognize its necessity at the moment or that I choose. And that's sometimes hard for me. There's still a sense of obligation that follows me around that I'm working with. And also whenever I go into really deep work and have these experiences of kind of recalibrating, I realize that we're always in this continual process of remembering and forgetting. Like we play that role for each other too. We're able to help each other remember, and we trigger each other to forget our deepest, truest self and source of wisdom, or our connection to consciousness or something beyond ourselves. And so the more that we make time to be in practice and in community with those who are committed to living from a more conscious place, the more likely we are to be in places where we can remember and see that in each other. And then forgive ourselves for, I guess sometimes, the remembering is sweeter because of the forgetting. So we we come with compassion for ourselves too.